he challenges and expands our understanding of what exhibitions can be, proposing that a true art event might emerge precisely in these moments of shared making, thinking and unmaking. So please join me in welcoming Dan Howard-Birt.
Thanks very much for that introduction. Hopefully some of those terms, because I use them, the art event, things like that, and they kind of don't really, they're a bit sort of orphaned, they just float around, but hopefully some of the things I might say now might pin them down a little bit, certainly in terms of the way I use them. But if this kind of thing, you know, some of the things we talk about, if I go through things too quickly or there's something that's interesting we want to refer back to, then we can just talk about that later. And we kind of figured that I'd run through something in here, and then more interestingly we could just wander next door and conclude this session by just looking at the show, and then we could speak much more informally. So the way I'm going to do this session in here is I wrote this thing about exhibitions, and it takes about 7 minutes to read, so I'm going to read that, but before I get there I'm going to just tell you a little bit about me so that you know where I'm coming from, and hopefully some of these things that I'm going to kind of seed now will kind of make some of the statements that I make in some way, contextualise them, but also kind of make sense. You know, I'm going to say some things which are quite, you know, definitive on my terms, or quite strongly worded, but I don't claim that to be a kind of universal truth. That's just what I need to power my own practice through. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background onto who I am, so that some of that makes a bit of sense. Then I'm going to read this short text, and then we're going to look at some other bits and pieces and see how it goes. Hopefully it'll take about 45 minutes. So the first thing I want to say is I'm 51 years old. My mother went to college. She was the first person in her family to go to college, and you know, she got a qualification. She became a teacher, and she was kind of ill. She kind of suffered with depression, and at a certain point she had to retire. She couldn't keep working, so she left work early. My dad, he didn't go to college, and through my life he did lots of jobs, and he was kind of amazing, but he did a bit of this and a bit of that. You know, he was in the army, and then he sold double glazing, and then he was a window cleaner, and then he ran a bowling alley, and so I just watched him do all these things. I've got two brothers. One of my brothers, he went to college, and he did get a degree, and now he manages allotment projects for groups of men who are out of work, who might work with them about growing things and eating things, and then he works with an allotment group with a school. I've got another brother, and he went to college, but he didn't finish. He dropped out. Ironically, he's got the best job of all of us. He works for a university in sort of data analysis. But anyway, that's my family. So we're sort of new at university, but we're sort of also very we've benefited from it, and we're really grateful from it. So I went to college, and I studied an undergraduate degree in fine art and history of art. And 3 years later, I then went back and did an MA, and I did an MA in painting. And then the day I left that, I moved from London to Scotland and lived for 4 years in Dundee. And I went there, I'd just done this painting MA, and I wanted to learn about exhibition making. And Dundee and Scotland were full of these artist-led spaces that you could just get there and get involved, join these voluntary committees, and you could, learn everything from, marketing to installation to curating to event organising, fundraising. You could do all of this kind of stuff, but it was an amazingly supportive and tight network, so it was a really wonderful place to learn things. And after 4 years, I left there and moved to Hastings. And when I got to Hastings, I got a job, like a arts job, and I was a curator for an Arts Council funded organisation. So that's kind of how I moved around, but now I live in Penzance, and I've lived in Penzance for 6 years. I've got these jobs, so I'm a painter, but I have to keep the studio and everything else going. So I run a building of artist studios and a project space and a residency programme in North London. I work there part-time. They pay me about £20,000 a year. I teach at Central St Martin's. I've got a tutor group there. They pay me about £5,000 a year. I work for an independent art school, and I do this kind of online kind of tutoring. They pay me £2,000 a year. I write catalogue essays for artists, and they pay me about £200 for an essay. And I've just done a show in here, and they paid me £1,500. It costs a bit more than that to make it, but So I'm telling you this because this is how I live, right? This is what I do. I've got 4 jobs, and I get that's enough to kind of keep things going. And then I'm not going to talk about these, but this is kind of when I left college, I was making that thing up there on the left, a big painting. It was just the corner of the studio with this text running through it, and it made sense at the time. Years later, you can see, in some way I still make still life paintings, but I didn't realise, whatever that was 30 years ago, I was interested in still life painting. But you can see, so that's kind of how things evolved, and you'll see the big flower painting in the gallery at the moment is the things that I'm most interested in at the moment. Look at that second one. It's like, that was in New York in, I don't know, however long ago that was, but it was, just carving kind of hay bales, and I was interested in text and this kind of poetics of occupying this space. It's kind of haunting, but I was also interested in organic materials. So I'm making flower paintings now, but all those years ago I was making things with hay bales. I suppose I just feel less need to do that kind of thing now, but maybe the thing next door is just as complicated, but just on other terms. So I'm going to read this text I wrote on the train on the way over, and it's kind of a way of thinking about why do exhibitions, what are the conditions by which exhibitions function in the way that we go to galleries and museums now, and how much of those are we aware of, kind of why things work the way they do, and how many of those things are perhaps unhelpful, and that maybe with a little bit of playfulness or scrutiny we might be loosed from some of the kind of concerns or the sort of limitations of that way of working. So I'm just going to read this text. Okay, now what are the things that we take for granted about exhibition making? Firstly, there's the obvious stuff, that the status of the institution confers value on the content. So if you do a show at the Tate, it's seen to be of greater value than if you do a show in my back shed. But there's something about the status of the institution. That white walls are a default norm because they provide a neutrality. That solo exhibitions are more desirable for artists than group shows. That exhibitions provide the space for the work to be completed by an audience. Some artists call this getting it out there. That artworks need titles. That the title might even be a part of the work. That it is important to tell the viewer what the artwork is made from, what year it was made in, and where the artist was born and now works, etc. Now, all of the above are of course true, but only sometimes. Most of the time, none of these is true at all. But we do it and think it anyway, because it's easy for us to perpetuate the status quo than to challenge where to begin to break these down. Here are some of the less obvious ideas that we can find ourselves regurgitating unchallenged, that likewise are not as watertight as we might hope. That artwork should be installed and lit to show them off to their best. Maybe that sounds like counterintuitive to propose the opposite, but I think in some way and maybe my show proposes that this question of their best is a kind of, it's a folly. There is no best. There are just different possibilities. Another thing we take for granted is that it's better to show new works than works which have been exhibited before. That curators should select the best work available from that artist. Again, I really don't understand why we think that exhibitions should have the best available work. We just did a solo show with a painter who's been knocking around for 20 or 30 years, and it was wonderful trying to convince him not to put the best work into the show. In the end it went in, but it was a long and fruitful conversation. Actually, the exhibition was better without it, but that's another story. The exhibition should run for as long as possible, so it's something we just presume, but not too long. That 4 weeks is perhaps the optimum duration. That galleries are better places for exhibitions than sheds or kitchens or cafes or bus stops. That exhibitions are a vehicle for gaining feedback. So how did we get to this culture of consensus thinking where we all presume that somehow we've discovered the ultimate mode for engaging with art, and that we no longer need to bother ourselves continuing to test these presumptions, or to be sympathetic to the possibility that as times change, so does the agency of artworks, its potency, and that the systems and conditions within which it functions should change too. We all know a little bit about why we have art exhibitions, how Western painting and sculpture in the Western idiom moved from the church and the palace to the proto-laboratories of the emerging natural scientists of the early Enlightenment in the form of cabinets of curiosities, and how these cabinets became expanded and exploded into our earliest museums, initially for private contemplation and then quickly for the betterment of society. In due course, temporary exhibitions became a focused element of museum practice, and eventually they were able to free themselves of the educative environment of museums and to align themselves with parallel systems of cultural and mercantile exchange, in other words, capitalism. With a growing number of artists and the emergence of the artist as individual voice and the artist as innovator of a singular style, and each of these artists needing to earn a living, artists were very happy with the new possibilities that exhibitions enables. As I suggest, it's not just sales that became possible at a different scale, but also a fresh way of looking closely at what happens inside exhibitions, between the artwork in the studio and then the artwork in the gallery, between the artwork and the architecture and the prevailing contexts, and fundamentally between the artwork and the person looking at it, quizzically, hungrily, appraisingly. Hence, 100 years ago, Marcel Duchamp and what much later Thierry de Duve called Duchamp's mayonnaise. 4 ingredients essential to a recipe which occur in different relative proportions depending on taste or tradition or happenstance, but without one, oil, vinegar, salt and egg in the case of mayonnaise, mayonnaise isn't really mayonnaise. So for Duchamp those ingredients are an artist to identify or select an object, maybe even to make an object to bear the significance of having been selected, a context to condition the act of looking and thinking differently than when not inside that context, that gallery, and an audience to look and think about the object selected by the artist and placed in this special context for looking. So this is brilliant. From here, Duchamp can rightly claim that the art event can only take place within a gallery, in the space between the viewer and the object, and only in the minutes that the object is being looked at or engaged with. Perhaps it leaves a residue in the mind to be worked over and explored later, but that's another story. Everybody loved this idea of the new specialness of galleries. It made it so that we could understand where galleries began and ended. We even collectively decided by the middle of the 20th century what galleries should look like inside, i.e. white walls, free of distractions. Later this uniform evolved to include the hiding of radiators, the removal of seating, the installation of even lighting, and then later poured grey concrete floors became desirable. And simultaneously we all agreed on the need for an introductory text or gallery notes, and for quietness, for the outlawing of touching, for the culture of the private view where networking is privileged over viewing. Gallery owners loved all of this because in these powerfully yet minimally designed rooms, art might appear special and strange and therefore desirable. Power could increasingly be wielded by the institution. After all, they were as instrumental in making the art event as the artist and the object, and as they wrote the notes, they could also frame the way the visitors thought about the works on display. Again, this manipulation of desire isn't just in the field of sales. Public gallery directors, academic institutions, even artist-led spaces could use their new authorial powers to meet their own needs, to advance their own agenda. Meanwhile, the politics of central and local government in this country shifted. High culture was seen to be valuable for advancing the prevailing values of government, but handily also for speeding up the regeneration of troubled neighbourhoods. Visual art seemed to be the best for this because its costs were modest compared to, say, theatre, and its manifestations are relatively docile and polite compared to, say, pop music. After all, the last thing local government wants is another disruptive punk explosion. And because visual arts is the perfect fit, it was art museums and galleries which were made free to access. Remember, this only happened in this country in 2001, kind of relatively recently. while cinema, dance, opera, theatre, etc. Retained their ticketed entry. Also, artists were already tied to the values of their class and were themselves enmeshed within the spheres of academe and of money. Where the artists went, money followed. What had been witnessed happening in Shoreditch, London, as the gentrifying impact of artist studios and impromptu gallery spaces became rolled out under the new Labour government at the turn of the millennium, with state-funded galleries in places like Wakefield and Margate. The content of these galleries keeps shifting too, as social and political ideologies change. The products of Brand Britain, of Cool Britannia, the evidence of Britain as a creative engine of innovation and entrepreneurial enterprise became replaced by messages about how we should live, what the morally appropriate values to espouse are. But the managing of content by government quango funding bodies, local authority priorities, and the vocal grandstanding of the so-called liberal left. Remember, this is also the period of the rise of curating courses. This all had consequences. Maybe because most of us going to these exhibitions already hold the values on display. War is bad. Colonial empires were and are despicable and have toxic legacies. There is no such thing as a normal body or sexuality or relationship with mental health, etc. We all agree with these positions. So we incrementally stopped looking, and so we became complicit in the unpicking of Duchamp's recipe. It's nice for us visitors to have our own values endorsed, or to share in the moral outrage of a given injustice, but that's hardly an art event. It's far closer to the effect of continuing to read your newspaper of choice or social media echo chamber, where the same observations and reflections are made from the same point of view on an evolving catalogue of tragic and unjust events. And now, 2025, it turns out that central government has lost interest, as to a large extent has the market, and so there's no money. So we have lots of well-lit white galleries with status-raising exhibitions and accompanying exhibition notes, but we've forgotten how to look at art, to approach it as a strange thing, a mysterious thing, an unstable thing, a problematic thing, a thing which seeds questions in us rather than provides quick answers. So, I wonder, we art makers and exhibition makers collectively continue to pretend that the way we've made exhibitions for the last 40 or 50 years is the appropriate way for us to show and to encounter art. It's with these questions in mind that I put together this exhibition. So, I wanted to just show a few exhibitions that are kind of significant in the way I'm coming into this process of exhibition making, but also to sort of raise some sort of things that I'll say, well, I'll go this far, but not that far. So just to remember, I very cursorily shoved this slide up here, and it's got a rather crass caption, but I go to hundreds of exhibitions a year, and most of them sort of look like this. And there's nothing wrong with this, but I do think that it, as in my introductory text, I think there's a lot it takes for granted, and I'm happy for us to kind of work with exhibition making in this way, so long as we are prepared to kind of scratch the surface of the sort of complicity it is within those systems of value that I'd made an attempt just now to kind of introduce us to. So when I was at art school, this is the kind of shows that were happening around London at the time. These are both exhibitions by an artist collective called Bank, and they would build these kind of goofy and kind of chaotic and sort of in some way kind of demeaning or mischief-making installations with these kind of dumb exhibition titles. But then then the shows would be full of the kind of great and good of that particular moment in London. The picture at the top, you can see on the far left, there's a work there by Chris O'Philly, and this picture at the bottom, the painting on the back wall there, is by Peter Doig. The people we now think about as being the establishment figures, they were kind of party to this too. This was quite cool for them. So I was kind of, when I was at art school, this is kind of what I was looking at, and kind of, in some way it seeded a lot of kind of the attitudes that I have now, although I wouldn't work in this way. Here's another example, Goshka Makuga. I mean, she's kind of terrific. It's two installations of the same work. The first one in 1999, the gallery's called here Sally Gaia, but actually it's just an artist's flat. And it's just a simple work where the interior of the space is covered in brown packing paper, and then artworks by other artists are just hung on top of it. Interestingly, in 2022 at Nottingham Contemporary, it was the work was remade. So in the late 90s, it felt like a really be there now kind of show, and yet even that had this kind of legacy where people want to kind of interrogate what was going on with what Goshka was doing at the time. But those things I just showed you, they're kind of bombastic in some way. Let's fill the gallery space with papier-mâché, let's cover the walls in paper, let's colour walls, or be disruptive. And that was necessary at the time and it was playful. But I'm just as interested in this strategy, where the imposition, the curatorial imposition, is really quite simple. So I don't think we have to be completely chaotic in exhibition making in order to kind of question or allow the viewer who's inside the exhibition to question their relationship with the objects and the way the objects are unpacking themselves for us. On the bottom here is a show by Phoebe Unwin, and she, it's just kind of a regular thing for her, not always in this way, but to hang all paintings with their top level. It's kind of so, I mean, it's one of the options, but it's kind of rarely applied. And then when it is, suddenly, by being there, we become hyper-conscious of this decision. And therefore, we can't just wander down the room, blandly kind of cruising past these works. We kind of keep asking ourselves, what is in this decision? What's the significance of this? And then, while we're trying to unpick that, suddenly we're closer to the works. We're able to get further into the works. And then the one at the top, that was just this year at Glasgow School of Art, and there was a bigger show around this, but they just asked all the participating painters to bring something unresolved from the studio, and they just installed it as if it was on a shelf. Again, it's the same principle as Phoebe's, and I just think it's just about enough to kind of unsettle those kind of the relationship we might have with the show. And then, this is a kind of, I threw this in just I think there's nothing more banal than the Royal Academy Summer Exhibition, for all of the reasons we might sort of share that point of view. And yet then Cara Thoring comes along and she hangs her room like this picture, and it's like everything's hung along the baseboard, and then it's got these great waves that erupt up at the side. So I got so excited about this installation because the picture at the top is what the Royal Academy usually looks like, and we're kind of familiar with that, and we can do our best within that. But she's just done something really kind of, she didn't have to do something crazy, but she did something, and it just stops you in your tracks and makes you kind of think, wow, how am I looking? Why am I looking? What are these gatherings? What is the energy? What's the dynamic that's achieved around the room by putting the pictures on the wall in this way? So I just threw these few examples in so that you could see the stuff I was looking at when I was at art school that I was kind of super excited about. But like I said, that's not the stuff I'm doing. Here's a show, a Baran Karimi show. This is on in London at the moment as well. Peter Doig, I'd mentioned him earlier. I mean, he's kind of like the king of art or something. He's like amazing, and very powerful, and very influential, and very successful. But he kind of has, he's kind of unsatisfied within that, or appears to be. So he recently took on a pub in the centre of London, and so this is a show of an artist he taught and who he's a big supporter of, and it's a major show, and it's kind of rather they haven't done anything to this pub at all. This is just the landlord's living quarters upstairs, and it's an 8-room show of Barangs, running from the year he entered college to now, and they're sort of hung half on walls or above the sink, and it's an extraordinary body of work, but there's something about the approach that is both generous to allow us to see the works as kind of unsupported or as unmediated as this. But there's also something kind of, exciting about the confrontations that are established between painting and fireplace, or things like that. That, let's face it, if we were fortunate enough to be able to buy works or own works, they'd have to sit sort of just to the left of the telly anyway. So when they get home, they have other stuff to compete with anyway. And so this show in some way kind of gives voice to that, artworks, there is a kind of way we presume artworks are best seen. But actually, this is the show I spent the longest in the last few months, just wandering back and forth through these rooms and kind of partially remembering things and wanting to check in on things or kind of revisit stuff. So I think it's a super exciting show. And here's another show. So Peter Doig, who facilitated that last show, he has a show in town too. And you can see what he's done here. It's full of furniture, it's full of these sound systems. He's got members of the gallery staff just play records in the space all day. It's a contentious show at the moment. Some people want to love it, some people want to hate it. What I found was really remarkable is look at the size of these speaker stacks, but somehow the noise, the sound, the music doesn't interfere with the act of looking at painting. Somehow looking at painting just continues to be possible through these spaces. On the left you see there's even a darkened room, there's a curtained room with like social tables. It's a kind of, it's at the Serpentine. It's it's a brilliant show. And I just think it's a kind of fascinating kind of pairing with, this is the thing he makes for somebody else, and this is the thing he makes for himself. Okay, that's enough of other people's bits and pieces. Just a brief introduction to this show then. I've got a bunch of slides of this, but we don't really need to linger on this because it's probably better if we wander through the show and just point at things. So Andy asked me to make this show here. He and I had worked together on a similar, or a show that perhaps this show came out of, Extra at the Phoenix there. And so I sort of, when he asked me to do this, I kind of had a feeling in some way about what he might be interested in. And so I sort of proposed, also I've just had twins with my partner and I, our babies are like nearly 1. So, there's not masses of time. So you're like, okay, well, it's possible. So, I don't want to do a solo show anyway, but, that possibility is like totally out. So I thought, here's a way of doing it. I've never worked this way before, but instead of curating other artists, what I'd do is I'd in some way curate other exhibitions. And they were exhibitions, most of them pre-existed. Lots of the people in this show I've never spoken to. I don't even know their names. I just had seen some shows, and as when they were coming to a close, I would just call the person responsible for it and say, can you not send the work back, and maybe we could just take the whole show to this other show. And, that's kind of an odd invitation for people to get, and they had to deal with that on their own terms and with their participating painters. But that's how I went about it. So I'm just going to quickly introduce you to the shows. This is vice versa. So there's a library in East London that hosts these exhibitions by a peripatetic organisation called Terrace. Terrace is just run by a single painter called Carl Bilek, but he facilitates all these other painting conversation shows. And but it's in the kind of cafe of the public library, so it's rather kind of in auspicious space. So kind of there's these wooden seat backs, and the paintings sort of go in the seat backs. So it's kind of you kind of go there and you're like, you want to get involved with this, but there's somebody taking a coffee in front of this painting you particularly want to look at, and I kind of love all that, however sort of kind of problematic it is. And he's such a painter's painter that these shows end up often being quite dense in kind of painting theory and kind of painting languages, and yet they really are able to thrive in this kind of other space. It's quite noisy space, it's quite busy space. So there's something about him that I really like. But this show, of all of the Terrace shows this year, this one really stuck out for me because it's curated by Johanna Melvin, and she's an abstract painter. She's a hard-edge abstract painter. But I'm really interested. I've always loved abstract painting, and in the studio I do try and make them. They're really hard. It's like they never leave the studio. But I love seeing abstract painting shows, and I'm kind of intrigued by the kind of energy of them. But I'm also interested in this funny kind of siloing that sometimes goes on between what we might call gestural abstract painting. I think gesture is a rather contentious term, but sort of, I suppose, messy or mucky or material abstract painting, and then this other form which comes from a whole other tradition of this kind of hard edge. They're both in some way trying to construct or elicit these kind of sense of painting space, receding or projecting spaces between colour relations, between borders, but they do it on very different terms, and they allow the presence of the paint matter to take on a different status within the work. It's not to say that in the hard edge paintings, the masking tape paintings, that they deny the role and status of the paint pigment. They don't at all, but it's much more nuanced in terms of that question of what's on the surface and how colour works. So anyway, I'd seen this show whereby Johanna had invited 12 painters of like materially rich abstract paintings and 12 painters of hard edge abstract paintings to make paintings of a certain size, in the full knowledge that they would then be bolted together with somebody from the other family. And I'm not in either of these camps, so I remember seeing this stuff and I was just thinking, I can't think of any one of these paintings or these pairs of paintings that's less good like this than their constituent parts. In some way, every painting is sort of better and richer because it's had to live in this way which is kind of goes against everything that all the traditions that it's set up to kind of be in discourse with, all its kind of modes of paint application, the relationship of decision making. It's given something that's right next door, which is saying, here's another way of thinking that. And because it switches, in the act of looking at these things, it switches back and forth constantly between these two routes into abstract painting making, neither of which is wrong, but by having this kind of this difference so tightly kind of forced that you're kind of aware the whole time of the kind of mechanics of painting making, and yet the paintings do more than that. So many of these pairs have been very skillfully kind of pitched together so that they do start to riff off each other. Sometimes it's around colour relations, sometimes it's around form. This one you can see sort of in the middle on this end. You have on one side there's these very thinly kind of dripped or pulled kind of grey-black horizontal brush strokes, and on the right is a much more laboured sort of pigmented fiberglass kind of skins of application, and yet both pictures, the structural dynamic of them is the construction of these kind of blocks, these two vertical blocks on either side of a kind of an empty band in the centre. So there were kind of shared compositional or formal kind of relations that kind of emerge by virtue of this kind of exchange that's kind of forced. So when this lot agreed that they would send the whole show down here, it was tremendous. And I knew that they'd just been stuck on the back of these chairs in this library, but I was too nervous to tell them I was going to put it on a bit of pink trellis. So they didn't know until they turned up. But actually it was quite a fight to get them to not come for the install. I just didn't want them around, but we can talk about that. Here you go, here's just some examples. I mean, you've seen it, so we don't need to linger on this. And then Millimetre. Millimetre is this picture frame, and it's been going about, 15 years or something, and it used to be in a cafe in Camberwell in South East London, and I loved it. And then it's run by one of the senior tutors at the Royal College, and so when the cafe became less interested in it, it then lived at the Royal College for a few years, just in one of the corridor spaces there. But then just the little space that I run in North London, the minute I took that job 10 years ago, I just said to this guy, I said, I want Millimetre in my place now. So now it's in the lobby of our project space. So Millimetre is a single frame, although there's two of them here, but it's group show. They're always group shows, and there's something around gathering things that have to live within a kind of a small space, but also they have to get quite close to each other. But also the curators or the directors of this project are very interested in things which are not quite there either. They're either preparatory studies or studio ephemera or kind of bits of leftover things. So they work quite a lot of print material too, so there's kind of often a second or third tier relationship to an object or a project or an idea that kind of that happen in this. And they're very interested in this tight space being a kind of a fecund space of kind of possibility for these objects to kind of kind of fertilize one another or something within this kind of strange confines. Now, like I said, Millimetre is a singular space. It's a single picture frame, but the event of being able to do a show here, I really wanted to demonstrate two examples of millimetre. The one on the far side is curated by Ian Malhotra, and who's a recent graduate of the Royal College, and on this side it's curated by the project, the people who run the project, Kate Scribner and Finlay Taylor. And in making these two frames, we're now going to send one of the frames to Cardiff. So from now on, all shows that happen in the first millimetre will then just go in a bag and go to Cardiff. So now it's a touring venue too. So in this show, in some way, kind of enables us to approach millimetre in a slightly different way. And then another project is Stage, and this is run by LLE or CHLI. It's they were a sort of free-floating artists exhibition group in Cardiff, and it was set up by a couple of artists, maybe, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. And they would show, they didn't have a space, but they would show Welsh artists in England and then sort of British artists back in Cardiff or Swansea or other places across Wales. So they were really interested in that exchange. Everything just sort of moved around in suitcases, and they were very simple and like unpretentious about things. But actually quite early on I was quite surprised that this is, I mean, art fairs are what they are now, they're kind of a weird thing, but like 15 years ago they were slightly stranger, and these LLE or CHLI used to do these kind of art fairs, so they just rent an art fair booth to do a group show in, and I always thought, wow, that's such a weird counterintuitive decision, but they didn't do it for very long. Art fairs became prohibitively expensive, but I was interested, they just did things differently. Anyway, one of the guys who set up LLE is still running it, but he's got two other collaborators now, and so it's a sort of slightly different team. But this project has been going for a few years. It's called Stage, and painters are either invited to make a painted backdrop or a painted panel, on the understanding that they're going to knock a whole load of nails through the backdrops, and then they're going to put these panels onto the backdrops. And as you can see, there's a grid of these in the middle here, and you can just wander in there and decide that you want to look at one thing next to something else, or on one backdrop or another. So it's at the visitor's behest, the kind of relationships that are established, and nothing is ever set up to be a definitive proposition. This is the third incarnation of it. So they first tested it actually at the space I run, and quite often things do get tested at the space I run just because that's the kind of show I ask for, something that we don't know whether it's going to work or not. But anyway, we did a version of it and it was okay, and then they went back to Cardiff to Bay Art and did a second version of it, which was much more confident, and now we here have the privilege of taking the third version. So not a lot's changed between those, apart from the people putting it together's familiarity and way of working with the constituent parts. Along the way, a few more artists get invited to contribute things, so it changes incrementally, but essentially it's just something that gets packed away and could kind of re-emerge anywhere. I love this idea that here's this show, Stage, it's taken place across 3 or 4 years in 3 different combinations, but it's still sort of the same show. It just looks and feels different wherever it goes. And some artists are really into it, and they can't stop them, so they keep sending more panels, and even these artists who have got quite busy careers and quite, they've got galleries who would rather they wouldn't do projects like this, but there's something that's refreshing for them about it. So I like that it feels like a safe space for artists to to continue to get involved on their terms, and I think the generosity of the exhibition makers speaks a lot to that. And then this is a project called Small Holding. Now this is the only project that didn't pre-exist this exhibition, and these are just a bunch of students that graduated in the last 3 years from the course I work on at St Martin's, and I didn't even realise they knew each other, but it transpired that they were all going to see shows together, and they were all regularly writing to one another, and one of them had left college a few years ago and had gone to live in France, but they were in regular contact to share works in progress, and it was really healthy. Anyway, the guy who was in France, I was on the phone to him one day, and I was talking about, maybe you could just come, when you come back from France, maybe just come into this project space and just use it as a studio for months and just get your feet back into making over here. And then he said, well, why don't I invite these other 3 people to come with him? So that's how that came about. And because by that point this show was being talked about, so then I said to them, well, you make your own paintings, but I want, in the course of the time that you're in this studio, to start forcing your objects closer and closer to each other, to the point that there's they're offered, or they have a relationship to you and the things that you're interested in thinking about, but some of those questions become a little bit more fraught. In fact, over the course of the time they were there, they gave up that and just started working on top of one another's paintings, and they would make collective decisions. So the big pink thing with the rakes in the middle of it, that was about 6 paintings before, and at some point, they would just say, right, that all needs to go, and they would just nominate somebody to just paint out the paintings that were there before. And so many of these have gone through these different iterations, and this kind of trust of one another to be able to lose in some way maybe the best bits of a painting, or the bit that I was most proud of, in order to serve this kind of unknown future. I love that relationship with painting. That's the kind of relationship with my own painting I have in the studio. So when I witness these people just being able to kind of tease that out of one another, I couldn't, it was so rich to me. I was really excited by just this place they'd arrived at. Some of them are kind of clunky, kind of full-on kind of material and kind of awkward painters, and some of them are quite refined and restrained materially, or in terms of their paint handling, and and so they were having to be very forgiving of each other's the things, the languages that were bringing into these kind of collective canvases. And in the end they started to bring in paintings that they'd sort of half finished before, for other people to then paint over. And we bought 6 here, but they were, after a month, I think they were like 30 or something. And this thing now, small holding as a kind of group of artists, is going to continue. So they'll each have their own practice, and then a couple of times a year they want to come back together to continue doing this, because something, they gained something from it that was, unexpected on all parts. So anyway, it's a real privilege to do this. It's the first show out of college, and they all got the overnight train down and the overnight train home just to come and be here for the opening. And so, they were just a pleasure to be around. And then finally, this is the painting I made, those paintings I showed you at the beginning. That one is that corner of the studio with some cans of paint in it, and it had this big yellow text through it, which is just some song that was playing on the radio a lot, and it was in my mind, and I just painted it into this space, and it was kind of inhabiting the corner of this studio. And I didn't, all these years later, I now inhabit these paintings with other things, but the other things that inhabit my paintings are other people's painting panels. So just to give you an introduction to this project, I make these, I kind of nominate a subject for the painting, and they're always quite bland or kind of open-ended or unpin-downable subjects. So the first one of these paintings with other people's paintings was, I just called it a cloud painting, and asked 7 painters to make small paintings of a cloud, but they could take that whichever way they wanted. It could be smoke or mist or a cloud, or somebody did a drawing of a horse. There's a cloud is like, I love it. It's so open. It's so, we all know what it is, but also nobody knows what it is at all. And then the second painting was a head painting. So I just asked lots of painters to make me a head, and again those kind of heads came in all, exquisite, languages. And so this is the third of these. And I said I was going to make a flower painting, so I just asked folk to make flower paintings for me. I thought, it's usual for people to say no, or I expect people to say no when I ask them, because I know some of these painters, and some of them are, busy and, successful, or whatever that means. But some of them I don't know at all, and I've seen some stuff in the shows or on Instagram or something, and so I do write to people out of the blue, and, I think a lot of art making or exhibition making is a trust relationship, and it's hard to trust somebody you don't know, but so anyway, I asked 10 people thinking, oh well, I'll get 7 back, and then when 10 people said they would do it, the painting had to get bigger, which is why it sort of looks like it is. So anyway, it's this flower painting that sort of grew, and then what happens is as the paintings arrive back from the other painters, I can't just cut the holes arbitrarily. I have to kind of work out where I think that painting serves the bigger painting. And then often, what will happen is the painter will, cut this hole and this painting will come in here. And some of these oranges, is to kind of play off this kind of the dotting, this larger dotting of colour that's happening in this area of the painting. This is Ben Sanderson's small panel, who was the Southwest Showcase artist a few years ago. So there's a reason for them being there. But also, as I put them in, that then changes my painting, and therefore I sometimes have to kind of work further back into my painting to kind of try and tie it back in order to better accommodate the paintings that have come in. So it's not like I just make something and cut some random holes and any old painting will do. It's quite a I like the sort of the I don't know, the kind of the attention to detail that's required to sort of make it seem casual but also feel right. Those terms are both really kind of difficult to pin down, but that's what I'm trying to do in the studio. I don't know what the answer is, but I'm not interested in arbitrariness. I'm interested in a kind of rhythm and a kind of and logic, an internal sense, and so I'm working really hard to try and capture that with all of these kind of moving parts. So just to whiz through just these pictures very quickly. So the pictures on the far side is of Ben Sanderson's, and then he lives down in Helston, Cornwall. On this side is Sammy Tapp. I taught her on something called Terps Offsite. She just graduated in Norwich, and she did a year of kind of being mentored in her studio in Tunbridge in Kent. And then the painting at the bottom is Jackie Hallam. It's a drawing on gesso panel. She's now in the Scottish, just north of Glasgow actually, but she used to be in Kingsbridge and then in Totnes for a long time. So she was down here a lot, but she won the John Moores Painting Prize, and it was like this really big deal, and it was like the whole world was kind of open to her, and there were lots of shows lined up. But then she became very ill very quickly with multiple sclerosis, and then she had a psychotic breakdown, and the two were related, but it's been a very long journey to she's very unwell still, has very limited physical abilities now, but she's now painting again after about 6 years, and so it's just really thrilling to be able to kind of make contact with her again and just say what is happening in the studio, and is there any way we can talk about pulling something out of the studio. And anyway, it's a real thrill for this thing to arrive from Scotland, and then I've just been watching what she's been on Instagram since, and the paintings are back to where they were. I mean, they're not as quick, there's not as many of them happening, but she's really, it's just a magic experience that in some way making this project kind of switched me back into that kind of relationship that was just extraordinary to behold. On the left in the middle there's a painting by Angus McCrum, who's in Berlin, and then on this side the pink painting is by Leah Nisa Stewart, who's in Sheffield. Ilka Cinerol made this painting on the right. Some of you know Ilka. He teaches on fashion here. The top on the far side there's Lorna Robertson. She's in Glasgow. She sort of did a few shows in her 30s, and then she didn't do shows for 10 years, and now she's in her mid 50s, and she's started to show again. So it's really wonderful to kind of watch her career, which she very decidedly turned off. She decided not to do shows or to work with galleries or to be a part of that, the sort of mess of that. I mean, there were lots of reasons. She was bringing up children, but also she'd felt very let down. But now she's got a new enthusiasm for it, and there are now galleries around the world who are working with those, and so it's glorious for her to get a panel from her in the post too. This one here, Stephen Chambers. Now he's in Berlin too, but I was my MA I think 20 years ago or something, and he taught me there, and this is sort of, haven't spoken to him since, and then this thing came from Berlin. I mean, I felt totally humbled by the whole process, but also just delighted when these things emerge and just what you can do with them. And the other thing to say about these, I don't own these panels, so I make the panels, and I write to people and say, will you do this thing for me, and I've got this panel, and I'll prime it how they want it, or I'll stretch canvas, or and then I'll post it to them in this box that they can then post back. But so they then make this thing, and I usually, it depends on the run up to the show, I think they had about 6 weeks to make something for this. But then they come and I cut a hole in my paint and put their painting in, but at the end of the show they own that painting still. So even if they want it back, I have to sort of take it apart and post it back to them. Some people leave them with me on long-term loan, but I'm also interested in the awkwardness of that in some way I'm making these paintings, but they're not commodifiable unless somebody wanted to involve some extraordinary legal practice to placate everybody's galleries, which I think would be a thankless task. And so I quite like the fact that and actually it's happened in the past that somebody wanted something back because they sold their panel, and now I've just got a painting that's just got a hole in it. So when that's going to be shown later next year, I've got to decide, there's three options. I either go back to that same guy and say, can you make me another one? Or do I ask somebody else? But then the likelihood is that the thing they make will have to go into some other part of the painting, and I'll then have to patch up that bit. Or do I just make a facsimile of the thing that he said to me? All of those things are in flux. And so anyway, making paintings like this for me is kind of thrilling, because you're never winning. You're always catching up with the thing itself in terms of how it's made, but also its legacy. And then the last two panels is Lara Davies. She's a relatively recent graduate of Royal College, but she was actually one of the founders of LLE, but she sort of quit all that to go and study painting. And then the blue one at the bottom there is by Sam Bassett. Some of you will know Sam. He's in Penzance, brilliant painter. And then look, we decided to hang the painting behind a pillar, because I sort of thought, let's not have any photos of it. Let's just make it slightly kind of awkward. These are the kind of decisions I make in exhibition making. I might regret that now, but at the time it felt like a good idea. Anyway, so just to conclude this bit of the session, I'm just going to show, so that's how I make that show, and that's how I make that painting. But again, it's not happening in a vacuum. I showed that Goshka Makuga at the beginning, that cave of other people's paintings in it. So, artists are kind of working in this way. Like this work down here, Haroon Mirza, this kind of installation of sound and moving image. The rushes, the film are actually outtakes of Jeremy Deller film, and Haroon was Deller's assistant for a number of years, and Deller just gave him permission to use the outtakes. So suddenly you've got this, it's documentary of these bats flying from this cave, so it's got content, but it also has this kind of weird provenance, that it's a sort of bit that Jeremy Deller threw away. And then a Guy Sherwin, excerpts of a Guy Sherwin film on the other screen. So, the things I'm making, I'm not claiming any kind of great kind of radical position on them. These are the things that kind of excite me. And then this Christopher Williams installation on the other side. Christopher Williams is an extraordinary photographer, but you can see that this is a show at the Whitechapel, but the walls were from some other show in Germany, and he just, the trouble with exhibitions is they build these walls, and at the end of the show they kind of take them down and put them in the skip. So Williams is always saying, well, I'll have those, and then they just appear, and that's what he hangs the next show on. And so just as his photography is interested in interrogating just what does it mean to use a camera, and to what is the kind of mechanics of the relationship between the world and the image, so too is he interested in the mechanics of exhibition. So he wants you to look at these exhibition walls, but they're the wrong exhibition walls. They relate to some other show, and they've got kind of ripped bits of label, or they've been half painted out because they've had another life. So he's interested in showing you that you're not just looking at art in a kind of neutral environment, that everything has already had layers and layers of history accreted into it. And then, of course, I suppose so I've showed you a couple of fairly recent kind of practices that I'm kind of busy kind of being enthusiastic about when I'm in my studio. But here, look at this Rauschenberg. I mean, it's completely amazing. Short Circuit, 1955. There's this little gallery, and he every year, an artist could invite some other artist to be a part of their summer program, and that's how Rauschenberg had been invited. I think Jasper Johns had invited Rauschenberg one year, so Rauschenberg's now on the inner circle, and then the summer comes around, and it's his turn. Rauschenberg can invite other people to be a part of this show, so he invites Susan Wheel and Jasper Johns and a couple of other people. Can't remember. But anyway, and then the gallery turned around to him and say, "Oh no, we've changed the rules. You can't do that anymore." So instead, he just built these doors in the front of his painting. He put a Susan Wheel in at the top and a Jasper Johns in on the right, and then he closed the doors and he called the painting Short Circuit. So he puts his painting in with this sign that here in red says open, so that when the paintings in the show you can open the doors, and then he somehow short-circuited the rules that this gallery had established for who is allowed in and who isn't allowed in. The other interesting thing about this painting is the Johns flag painting was stolen in around 1995, I think, and so again, it's like the problem I have when somebody wants their painting back. Suddenly you've got this kind of object that's missing an object. So Rauschenberg's solution to that problem is he had Elaine Stuyvesant make a facsimile of the Johns, which is kind of in line with her practice. And so suddenly you have this thing which is speaking of the story of this object and this, how this painting came about, but it's also sort of networked into kind of those relationships between those artists within their own studios and peripatetically, like across studios. And then, that's probably as good a place to finish as any. This is just another show that happened quite recently. I'll just show two more slides, this one and where I stole this idea from. I asked 86 painters to make a painting for a group show just after lockdown, and when they arrived I was really interested in the kind of the physical relationships between them, so we decided to hang all of 86 paintings on one wall, and then on the wall opposite we just put loads of hollyhocks. And I kind of thought, looking at paintings is quite hard, so maybe if you come in you could sort of practice with the flowers, get used to kind of colour and space and line and depth and all of that kind of stuff, and then when you're warmed up, maybe you could then look at the paintings. Because it didn't work, nobody was that interested. But anyway, we did it. But I just want to show you this. So this is where I got that idea from. This is a show at KW in Berlin. They did a painting show, and they had, I can't remember how many painters were in this, but they decided to hang all the painters on one wall. That kind of stuff makes perfect sense to me. So that's my relationship with exhibitions. As I'm hoping is apparent, I'm sort of sceptical about the things we take for granted about exhibitions. Then I go to the studio and I make these paintings in a particular way where I've evolved this way of there being something of mine, but the thing of mine is kind of complicated by these other presences and these other relationships that I then have to establish. But I take exactly that methodology into exhibition making too, that I'm interested in what other people have got to contribute to the conversation, but I'm not interested in a kind of the benevolence of collaborative practice or the kind of niceness of it. I do like people to offer me something, and then I'll have to work it on my terms, and I do, I work really hard to kind of make the show feel, the energy of the show feel right, and some of the relationships within the show to feel right. So there's something I'm striving for that I might think is progressive in some way for my own sake. I want to get better at exhibition making and better at painting. So it's not like an anything goes arbitrariness, but by the same stretch, I'm not. I'm sort of throwing sort of trip hazards into the route all the way through to try and keep the process as alive as possible.
I don't know. Has anyone got any immediate questions for Dan before we move to the gallery?
Yeah.
Hey.
Yeah. You started off talking about the institutions and the value given to them, and everything since then has been inside the white cube. Do you do anything outside to circumvent?
Yeah, it's interesting. I probably did more of that before. Funnily enough, we have this project space at work, and I'm always trying to mess with it, and my curator won't let me. But I'm a boss, and so maybe we should have a conversation about, can we try it just for a while? But anyway, my partner and I, we lived out in just the back of St Just for a couple of years in this village out on the moor, and we had a shed at the bottom of the garden, and we used to do shows in that. And we had some really great shows. They'd last one day. We'd open them on a Saturday afternoon, and folk would either drop in or not. And and that would be it. And they were really great, and they were magical. We just ran them through the summer, and we did funny group shows, and then we did this solo show by an artist who's in London now, but he was living in St Just at the time. And I don't know, there's this guy Mark Leckie. I mean, I love him. I love the work. He's brilliant. But he's this kind of weird sort of art god thing. If you're anyway, I don't know him, and he sort of DM'd me on Instagram saying, "Oh, do you mind if I get fish and chips and bring the kids round?" And it's like, there's this shed at the bottom of the garden in this village, and suddenly, like, we're sitting across the table talking about, plans he's got for PS1 in New York, and he's kind of come to see the show. So yeah, I do like shows in non-white cubes, but the reason I say that anecdote is that it's weird who comes and who doesn't come. It's not like white cubes are kind of audience magnets and other spaces are, problematise relationships with audiences. I think both are sort of problematic on their own terms, but both are also like rich with possibility, and just strange things happen. I've probably organised in my career, maybe 40 shows, and you're probably right, probably 2/3 of them are in white spaces, and that's possibly just because that's where I get asked to make shows.
Wasn't criticism.
No, but it's a great observation. I mean, my privilege of being in and out of London for work is there are people. There's a canal towpath with an underpass over it, and somebody runs a space on the bridge. So the painters just go up on the bridge for a night, and people gather on the towpath. And she also runs a space in a telephone box on Whitechapel High Street. There's another guy who's just put a box on the side of his canal barge, and people just see it by walking past. Those are the things that really inspire me. I love those. I'd love to be involved with more of those. But it is everywhere. But you have to sort of scratch the surface to find it.
Do you think, especially on that vice versa one, could they exist somewhere else outside your curation of it?
As separate panels? Yeah, I think they will. I think they will be returned to those painters, and they will fit very nicely into those solo shows by those painters. In my opinion, they won't be as good, but that's just because I'm interested in problems. I'm interested in awkwardnesses. So when these paintings are forced to coexist in a really kind of problematic way, and yet something of value emerges from that, then of course I'm super excited by that.
So,
Yes, yeah.
what do you, painting's been around for a very, very long time, what do you see as is there a movement in contemporary painting at the moment?
There's a horrible permissiveness. There's a sort of anything goes of painting, and which is, I'm kind of, it's like you don't have to, it's like codes of rugby or something. I don't know anything about rugby, but you can choose what you want, right? You can choose what you're into. You can follow a league or a sport or a team. You don't have to. Art paintings like that, right? So you can get really deep with the stuff that you need and you feed off. There's been a problem with sort of painting and conservatism in the last few years. The cost of living is kind of crazy, but people have also been sold this kind of myth that there's money to be made, and now I think there's a sort of dawning that money's not there anymore, or if it is, it supports a kind of the 0.5%. But you're right to say there's a long painting history, and so through that history, there were lots of ways for painting to be vital, and I think it continues to be. But you do have to sort of navigate through a lot of sort of I don't know. I don't really mean, but it's kind of it doesn't feel like there's much going on in in certain practices. I'm not sure if I'd go as far as to say there's a push towards anything. I just think, no, I don't know actually. Maybe if something occurs to me, I'll let you know.
Thank you.
Thank
Okay.
you, Dan. That's great.